Today's discussion is on North Korea and what comes after Kim Jong-Il. When Kate and I initially talked about this program during the winter break, we thought it would be a nice, cozy little seminar. And then we started seeing the RSVPs, and I think we were smart to move it into the auditorium. I think what we'll do this afternoon is we'll have each of our speakers, and I will introduce them in a moment, start with an initial intervention about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up to questions, about 20, 25 minutes of questions, and we should be done promptly at 3 o'clock. My name is Victor Cha. I'm a professor of government here and director of Asian Studies at Georgetown, as well as the Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. To my immediate right, it's a pleasure to introduce to you Jong-Il, who is an assistant professor at the School of International Service at American University. She is a Korea-Asia expert with training in security studies and international relations. She has taught at Oberlin College and at Georgetown and has been a POSCO visiting fellow at the East-West Center. From 2005 to 2010, she was the co-contributor of the Japan-Korea Relations column for Comparative Connections Pacific Forum CSIS, and is currently a non-resident James Kelly Korean Studies Fellow. She holds a PhD in government, as well as an MA in security studies from Georgetown. So it's a particular pleasure to have. She was actually a former student of mine, and Kate, Professor McNamara's. So you see, there is a future after Georgetown, right? She's a distinguished professor now at AU. Sitting next to her is Michael Green. Michael Green is a professor of international relations at Georgetown. He is also a senior advisor and holds the Japan chair at CSIS. He previously served as special assistant to the president for national security affairs and senior director for Asian affairs at the National Security Council from January 2004. No, this is not right. So from 2001 to 2005. He has also been a faculty at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior advisor in the Office of Asia-Pacific Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He received his MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS. Sitting next to Professor Green is Paul Pilaar. He is Director of Graduate Studies for the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown. He retired in 2005 from a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, in which his last position was National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia. Earlier, he served in a variety of analytical and managerial positions, including as Chief of Analytic Units at the CIA, covering portions of the Near East, the Persian Gulf, and South Asia. Professor Pilaar also served in the National Intelligence Council as one of the members of its analytic group. He has been executive assistant to the CIA's Deputy Director for Intelligence and executive assistant to the Director of Central Intelligence, William Webster. He also headed the Assessments and Information Group of the DCI Counterterrorist Center, and from 1997 to 1999 was Deputy Chief of the Center. He was a Federal Executive Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is a retired officer in the U.S. Army Reserve and served on active duty from 1971 to 73, including a tour of duty in Vietnam. I guess to start us off, let me just begin with a couple of very brief remarks and then go to my colleagues. So I think it's fair to say that on December 19th, none of us expected to hear that the North Korean leader was dead. I think it's fair to say that nobody, probably in the entire world, expected to hear that the North Korean leader was dead. And that they are now in the process of a transition, which we are seeing occur before our very eyes, of transferring power from Kim Jong-Il, who was the leader of North Korea formally from about 1994, but effectively really going back to 1980. So he's trying to hand over power to his youngest son, who's a little older than most of you here in this room, somewhere in his late 20s, as part of a third dynastic succession in the history of North Korea. Obviously a very important event for Korea and for the region. I think some of you have seen footage on CNN and other places of the funeral, as well as maybe some of you have seen pictures that they have tried to put forward, trying to establish this new leader by showing him talking to his military and squeezing himself into the cockpit of an airplane and a variety of other sorts of things. You know, I think it's fair to say what we know now is that this is a leadership transition that is a work in progress. I don't think anybody expected that they would have to do it at such a quick pace. Certainly after the North Korean leader had a stroke, he had a stroke in August of 2008, they probably began thinking very seriously about how they would continue this family-run country. But it's probably fair to say they thought they'd have 5, 7, maybe 10 years to do this, not the 20 months that we know of that they have been doing to try to effect this leadership transition. Sort of key folks, I mean, key parties involved here, obviously the military plays a very important role in this leadership transition. The elders of the party play a very important role. And of course the family, the Kim family themselves, play a very important role in whether this process will carry out. I think it's fair to say, I mean, probably many of you don't follow this as closely as we do up here, but there's been a very vigorous debate in the expert community as well as in the policy community about what the future looks like. And at least the way I see this playing out is we have, essentially we have some optimists and we have some pessimists, right? Optimists are people who look at the very orderly funeral ceremony. They look at the very deliberate efforts to make clear that this third son, Kim Jong-Un, is in charge. They've been putting a lot of pictures to show that he's in charge. And there are many who sort of see this very workmanlike effort at going through the steps for the funeral procession, his placement, giving this young son all these titles, including Supreme Commander of the military, all these things as part of a very stable and orderly transition process that they have been preparing for some time. And so the bottom line for a lot of the so-called optimists is there's nothing new here, right? It's the same system. They've just replaced one head with the other. And we're in for a lot more of the same old North Korean behavior. Right? On the other hand, there are pessimists who see this as a very major shock to the system, that they've done the funeral procession largely because that's gone well because they've done it once before. They did it in 1994 when Kim Il-sung died. But that beyond the funeral procession, which again they have a playbook for, they don't have a playbook for a 20-month transition to a 20-something-year-old who doesn't know what they're doing. And so pessimists see a bit of calm now, but down the road, they see this is not holding together, that the system, the leadership transition itself is probably going to have problems, and then once the leadership transition has problems, the whole question of the viability of the entire system gets called into question. And so I think, in both the expert community and I would say in the policy community within the U.S. government and governments around the region, in South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere, in China, they're having these debates right now. And it's not clear, I think, where everybody stands on these things. And there are lots of questions. I think there are lots of questions. Personally, I tend to be more on the pessimist school of thought. I think that it's going to be very hard for this system to continue the way it is. And people thought there was a big shock to the system in the mid-1990s when they had the death of the first leader and a famine at the same time. And some people look at that data point and they say, If they could survive that, that was the critical test. They can survive anything. And personally, I think there are a number of arguments and a number of things that have happened since 1995 that make this shock perhaps even more devastating, perhaps even fatal, whereas the first one wasn't. So with that, I don't think we actually agreed on an order for this. I have to warn you that at least 2 of these members on the panel are suffering from physical deficits today. Professor Lee just got off a plane from Korea last night, so she's jet lagged, but she can also tell us what's going on in Korea. And Professor Green has been up with his infant child all night, and apparently watched 3 movies last night, as he was 2 movies as he up to. But Paul looks like he's in great shape, so maybe we should start with Paul.
Oh, start with me? All right. Well, thanks, Victor. No, I can't claim either jet lag or infant children keeping me up, but you'll notice in the bio that Victor gave you one thing absent from that was North Korea expert. So I have to start with that disclaimer, but I was asked to provide some perspective as far as intelligence issues are concerned on the problems that Victor just described. The DPRK, North Korea, is, for reasons that should be pretty obvious, a very tough intelligence target. It is a highly controlled, closed society with everything that implies with regard to difficulties of access and other aspects of the intelligence collection business. If you think for a moment, say, of human recruitment, which of course is only part of that business, what you are confronting is a tightly controlled police state, which means you not only don't have the access, but you also have all of the fear and trepidation on the part of people who might otherwise be your recruits. And then on the technical side, communications intercepts and so on, well, North Korea is a place that just doesn't have as many communications. It's not a country where half the citizens are walking around with cell phones, let alone the latest in high-speed business connection, throughout the country and so on. Probably the biggest handicap of all is we don't have an embassy, no official presence. And I would expect if through some strange turn of events we were ever to have formal diplomatic relations with the DPRK and open a mission in Pyongyang, the intel types over here would be among the most pleased by that. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. There are several major subject areas that we've thought of when we think of North Korean intelligence. First and foremost are the weapons programs, especially the nuclear program, but also the work on delivery systems, especially ballistic missiles. And this is an area where the U.S. intelligence community has had a long history of work. To a large degree, I think most of the main judgments about the status of the programs, especially on the delivery systems, has kept pace fairly well with what the North Koreans are actually doing. But some of the big gaps, become apparent now and then. For example, with the nuclear program, which has, for the most part, been a matter of looking at plutonium production in nuclear reactors, but there has also been this other dimension of uranium enrichment, which, to the extent that that program is taking place, has been a huge gap. There were some indications of such a program going on, but the first real anything that could be considered a confirmation was a statement by the North Koreans themselves to a visiting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State some years back. When weapons have been tested, then there's other stuff that the collectors can do to find out more about it. I mean, after that first nuclear test, for example, all the techniques were used with sniffers in the air to try to detect what the isotopes were and all that sort of thing. As you may recall, that first test was perhaps a fizzle. It was so small in yield that there was some suspicion at the time that it might have been just a simulated test, and they set off a whole pile of high explosives rather than a nuclear device and tried to fake it. I don't think that was the subsequent judgment, but it was one of the issues at the time. On-the-ground inspection, to the extent that you have it, and of course in North Korea we've only had it in a very sporadic, ad hoc kind of way, but when it happens, that's one of the main sources that the collectors can use. So when you have somebody like Sig Hecker, the former head of one of our national labs, who went on a visit with some other Westerners, the analyst over here, sees on the observations of an expert like Hecker to bring back whatever he possibly can. So there's the whole weapons side of things. That's going to continue, I think, to be the main thing we look to the intel community to provide some insight on. Then you've got the whole question of North Korean intentions, not just what are they doing with their programs and what their capabilities are, but what do they intend to do with the weapons capability or whatever other capabilities they have. And here, quite frankly, I don't think intelligence is going to provide us many additional insights. The sorts of games that the North Koreans have been playing with the nuclear program as a kind of attention getter are pretty well known and understood to experts like these. Intelligence is not going to add that much else. It would be great, of course, to have the well-placed source that would be the fly on the wall, witnessing high-level decision-making or discussions in Pyongyang. You can't expect to have that. Even in regimes that aren't anywhere near as closed as North Korea, you can't expect to have it. But I would add to that as well, even if we did have that kind of source, given some of the things that Victor just mentioned in his introduction, that is to say, the pessimistic view that they don't have much of a playbook beyond the funeral ceremony, I think what you're talking about is a North Korean leadership that itself hasn't made many of the key decisions that we would be most interested in. So if they haven't made them, we sure can't find out about them. Then there's the politics within the regime, and here's where the analyst would practice a latter-day version of Kremlinology. What the Soviet analysts always used to do every time on May Day or the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. They'd study the pictures of the guys lined up on top of Lenin's tomb, and if anybody changed places, then all kinds of conclusions would be reached about who was up and who was down. And that sort of stuff, has to take place as well, and is taking place with the North Korean regime. But that obviously is an art that has limitations as well. I suspect, a channel I would look to, and I don't know whether we're getting anything out of this or not, is discussions with the Chinese, who clearly have access and interaction that we don't have. And then finally, there's the overall trajectory of the regime. Is it going to implode? This is sort of the grand question that, however misdirected the question may be, looking at the intel people, it's going to be asked of the intelligence types. And I would guarantee you, if the regime does implode, or something that could merit the title implosion, then it will immediately be categorized as an intelligence failure, no matter what the intel people said. So last word, this particular regime has long been a source of hand-wringing about what intelligence can and cannot do. In June 1950, when North Korea invaded across the parallel to start what became known as the Korean War, I think it was just within a couple of days of the invasion, after Dean Acheson and the Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, went to the Hill as the Truman administration was scrambling to respond. They were asking for extra appropriations and so on and so forth. And the members of Congress on the other side of the table, they didn't want to talk about any of this. They just wanted to ask, why weren't we warned about this? And Acheson and Johnson said, well, ask Hillenkelder, the then Director of Central Intelligence, and they hauled him up there later the same day. Things haven't changed all that much, and everything from the nuclear program to who's on first in the regime will continue to be the sorts of questions that we'll look to intelligence, but I expect we'll learn more from experts like the ones to my left. Stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Mike?
I'm going to make a brief opening intervention on U.S. policy implications and where we are, and then Japan. And when I was in the NSC staff, we were pretty much hammered relentlessly every day by the New York Times. In the way our friends in the Obama NSC are now being hammered every day by the Wall Street Journal. You got kind of used to it. And then one day in early 2003, the New York Times had an editorial saying, we really ought to feel sorry for the people in the Bush administration who have to work on North Korea. It's the hardest problem in government. They must have done something wrong in a previous life. That's what it said. So state, NSC, DOD, for about an hour that morning, all the email traffic was, what did you do? What did you do? What did you do? It is one of the hardest problems in government. And since then, it's gotten even harder. North Korea has tested 2 nuclear devices, has used deadly force against South Korean civilians and a naval ship, has transferred some level of capability, we can talk about that, to Syria. And with each stage of North Korea's violations of previous agreements and perfection of its weaponization missile programs, the North Korean view has been, you now owe us more. Whereas understandably, our view, the Korean view, the Japanese view is, no, 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 you owe us more because you cheated. So the prospects of a breakthrough and the expectation, I think, in this capital, in Seoul or Tokyo, that we're actually going to solve this thing diplomatically, I think have really sort of been dashed. It's a pretty pessimistic view, which raises the question, why was the Obama administration prepared, according to various accounts, to announce food aid to North Korea and perhaps the beginning of a new level of engagement just days before, days after Kim Jong-Il died. They were queuing this up. It's not clear how close they were, but they were queuing things up to begin getting it back on track with the diplomacy. And I think the answer is not that the administration expected a breakthrough, but that they were worried that things could actually get worse without some level of engagement to go with a lot of pressure that had been put on the regime after their bad behavior. And I think they're not wrong to be worried. The North Korean propaganda machine for the past few years has declared that 2012, which is the 100th anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth, will be the year of a strong and prosperous country. And optimists say, oh, prosperous, so they want economic help. There's room to negotiate. But also the propaganda machine in Pyongyang has said for some years now, 2012 will be the year they are a full nuclear weapon state. I think rather than it being a question of, in 2012, will they want to be prosperous and try to get aid, or will they want to be a nuclear weapon state, I think the answer is yes. They probably, if you're betting money, which is never safe in the North Korea game, but they probably want both. So the challenge for the administration, for our allies in Seoul and Tokyo is, how do you manage an engagement process where you're fairly certain, or at least you're worried, that they're going to blow up another device? Because this is, after all, not just a diplomatic negotiating tool, it is a weapons program that's seen as vital to the survival of the regime. So how do you manage this process to try to get some traction, try to prevent further provocations, especially in election years, and there's an election in every one of the 6-party countries except North Korea, including Japan likely. And so how do you manage this to get through this sensitive period? Not easy, not easy. And the Kim Jong-un succession makes it even more uncertain and a bit complicated. In this optimist-pessimist scale, the optimists say, look, the transition's gone fine. It's going according to plan. He's become these various posts. The Korean People's Army has come out and said he's the great commander, et cetera, et cetera. But Kim Jong-il had, as Victor said, 2 years to basically set this up, and they'd done it, elements of it, in 1994. I think the real test of the durability of this new regime is going to come later this year when Pyongyang and Kim Jong-un have to decide whether or how to shift from the mode of engagement to see what they can get in the way of aid to a mode of hardline and tests and provocations, which is generally the pattern in which I think the regime has telegraphed is quite possible in 2012. So it's one thing to step into a succession that's been arranged. It's another when you have the hands on the controls and you have to kind of manage this process. When do you hardline? When do you softline? How do you advance your nuclear weapons program? How do you make nice with the neighbors to try to get concessions? When and how do you pivot? That's a pretty delicate game that Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung had decades to perfect. And we'll see whether this 27 or 29-year-old can handle it. And we may begin to get the first senses of how fragile or unpredictable his leadership is going to be. Briefly on Japan, Japan's former minister in charge of the abductee issue. North Korea has abducted probably dozens of Japanese citizens. Mr. Nakai met in Beijing with North Korean counterparts. The press has been very excited about this. All I would say is that Nakai-san has wanted for some time to play this role, and that there's a long history in Japanese politics of politicians on their own cognizance deciding that they will negotiate with the North Koreans. Usually the foreign ministry or the government will send an interpreter so that they can see what happens. I don't think this is a major outreach by the Japanese government. Tokyo, like Seoul and Washington, would like to calm things down this year, but has been burned so many times that I think major concessions are unlikely. And in many respects, Tokyo, like Seoul and Washington, are simultaneously gearing for a much rockier road, which is why Kurt Campbell, our Assistant Secretary at State, Sugiyama-san, the Director General for Japan, and then Im Sung-won, the Korean Director General or Deputy Minister in charge, met yesterday. And I think they talked not just about how to engage, but contingency thinking about what we do when this thing goes to the next stage of what is probably a North Korean plan to continue developing nuclear weapons. So 100 days is the usual Confucian period of mourning. It's roughly 100 days to April 15th, Kim Il-sung's birthday. You know, there's a certain, the only predictor that I had when I was in government for when North Korea would do bad things was that it always happened when I was on vacation. Yeah. But I'm not in government anymore, so that's not a good predictor. The other date I'd watch is April 15th, which is auspicious for a number of reasons.
Great, thank you. Professor Lee.
Great, thank you, great to be here. I wanted to briefly talk about Kim Jong-il's death and the relations between China and South Korea. If you look at how countries surrounding the Korean Peninsula have reacted to the news of Kim's passing, it gets very clear that it was China that acted most decisively and quickly to offer an explicit endorsement of the generational succession to Kim Jong-un. North Korea, within the 4 hours of official announcement of Kim's death, Pyongyang received a message of condolence from the Chinese government. Within the next 2 days, at North Korean embassy, you will see President Hu Jintao, Vice President, Premier Won Jae-bao, Vice Premier, Foreign Minister, top legislator, and other senior officials coming and paying condolences to North Korea, reconfirming traditional friendly relations between the two countries. And this was followed by Foreign Minister Yang calling Russian, South Korean, Japanese, and US counterparts to emphasize how important it is to maintain stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. So in South Korea, this has been dubbed as China's condolence diplomacy, and it seems that this actually has sent a strong message to many in South Korea. And there seems about 3 responses or views about this. One is growing South Korean concern over North Korea's deepening dependence on China, not just economically, but also politically, with this new regime is trying to stabilize with the help of the Chinese leadership. Second response is that the Lee Myung-bak government's North Korea policy is under increasing criticism, mostly coming from progressives within the South Korean political spectrum that President Lee's North Korea policy of discontinuing inter-Korean dialogue and inter-Korean economic cooperation actually got rid of whatever leverage that Seoul used to have over Pyongyang, which in turn increased North Korea's reliance on China. Third response that you will hear is call for revisiting South Korean policy towards China to have more balanced approach between US-ROK alliance on the one hand and Seoul-Beijing relations on the other. And you actually hear that there is a growing awareness that US-China rivalry in Asia has been raised to a next level. President Obama's proposal of Trans-Pacific Partnership and Hillary Clinton's announcement of America's return to Asia, these measures have been taken by some in South Korea as a countermeasure or counterbalancing against growing influence in China. And the other interesting thing that's taking place in South Korea, cautiously but increasingly, is this idea that when they start thinking more about the question of unification, it may actually be China more so than the US that they have to try and think managing relations with, especially when it comes to this question of unification. So having said that, what is China actually thinking with regards to North Korea? Some in South Korea have expressed concern that Chinese intentions are, may be to move its troops on the other side of their border in the event of internal chaos in North Korea. And some, you will actually see some speculations in media outlet that some South Koreans are concerned that China is intending to turn North Korea as part of Chinese territory, as part of its province. Well, are these concerns exaggerated and groundless? I would say yes, they are, and no, they're not. Well, perhaps the correct answer is that we don't know, right? But I would suggest that we look at the history and the geography, which will have a very important clue to this question when you think about the nature of Chinese strategic interactions and interest towards North Korea. You probably have heard the expression lips and teeth that is commonly used to describe the nature of relations between Beijing and Pyongyang. Actually, the original term sunmangchihan literally meaning if you lose your lips, your teeth get chilled. You find the similar logic and expression actually in Ming Dynasty's official documents towards Korea. Basically, historically speaking, Chinese policy towards Korean state was not to militarily subjugate, but to use it as a buffer or fence to China. So when you think about this, if you look at historically speaking, when you look at the times when China militarily intervened in the affairs of the Korean Peninsula, it was, say, late 16th century, Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea. It was only when the Japanese forces came all the way to Pyongyang. So the basic logic from the Chinese perspective is that when you lose the Liaodong area in Manchuria to any power that is hostile to the Chinese, the defense of Beijing will be in danger, will be threatened. So when we think about Chinese participation and efforts for engagement towards the six-party talks, it is not simply to avoid the flow of North Korean refugees into the Chinese border. It actually has an element of national security towards the defense of Beijing. So, two policy implications from the history. One, I don't think it's going to work to keep telling the Chinese to put pressure and place economic sanctions on North Korea. Why? Because it's simply not in the Chinese interests. I think when they're looking towards this nuclear issue, their eyes are not necessarily on North Korea. Their eyes are on the US forces in South Korea and Japan, and also on the kind of regime that a unified Korea might actually make right next to China should such unification occur. Secondly, there has been a great deal of frustration on the part of South Korea with regards to Chinese reactions to the sinking of South Korean Navy vessel Cheonan and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island. We sometimes hear and see the view that Chinese are actually embracing North Korea. There's that division, Cold War division right there. But I don't think it's in Chinese interest or their policy to embrace North Korea and drive Seoul away from Beijing, further closer to Washington. I think they do want to have policy of equidistance, and you see actually Chinese making these diplomatic efforts. But politically speaking, I don't think it's going to be very effective, especially when North-South Korea relations and US-China relations aren't that great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have, given our time, we have about 20 minutes, so I think we should just go to the audience and see if any of the students or any of our guests in the university community have a question. We have two mics going around. Professor Harley Balzer had a question.
Thank you. I'm Professor Balzer in the government department. And this may be a slightly unfair perspective to ask from you folks, but I'm teaching a course on the political economy of communism. In 1989, a third of the people in the world lived under communist economic systems. Now it's down to 0.003%. So I can't decide whether my feeling for the Koreans is that it would really be nice if there were reforms, or it really should stay the way it is because I need an example to show my students. But I was wondering if, in all these tea leaves that you're reading, you have seen any indication of possible changes. I mean, even the Cubans now have embraced reform. The North Koreans backed away from it. Or if not, what is the real obstacle? Is it that the elite is too well entrenched in the system?
So there's this now famous. It's not a story. It's actually true that this newest leader of North Korea, this 20-something-year-old, spent a portion of his life studying in Switzerland. Right? Apparently likes NBA, the NBA, Chicago Bulls, Los Angeles Lakers. Went to an exhibition game in Paris. Apparently. Took courses on comparative government, including a course in 2000 on the American election, presidential election. So it raises the question of, is this a new and enlightened leader? And it could be in the sense that he does have this sort of education. I think the problem is that that's one person in a system that is not at all enlightened. And in fact, the leadership that surrounds him, from the military, from the party, and from elsewhere, I guess you would consider this the post-Cold War generation of leadership in North Korea. The difference, of course, is that the post-Cold War, when we say post-Cold War leadership, we normally think of a more enlightened leadership. But the post-Cold War leadership in North Korea is far less enlightened than the Cold War leadership of North Korea. Right? Because the Cold War leadership actually had relationships with Romania and with East Germany, and Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea, used to go vacationing with Erich Honecker and Ceausescu. And so there was a lot that they could do and see. This current generation of leadership, what are their empirical reference points? It's the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? It's the Arab Spring. Almost every deposed leader in the Arab Spring was in power longer than Kim Jong-Il, and they're all gone. And it was the Chinese Communist Party almost losing control in Tiananmen Square in 1989. So there's nothing comforting. And of course, when you're talking about a brittle dictatorship that's trying so much to hold on to power right now, the last thing that they want to do is reform, because reform is synonymous with giving up some political control. That's what happens in these sorts of systems when they try economic reform. You have to be willing to give up a little bit of political control. China could do it because Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. Right? Money was important. But in North Korea, one, there is no Deng Xiaoping. Right? Kim Jong-un is not Deng Xiaoping or Gorbachev, for that matter. And two, to get rich is glorious. Political control is still the most important commodity for this leadership, not money. And I think that's what makes it difficult.
Trying to picture Ceausescu, Honecker, and Kim Il-sung vacation, and I keep thinking of Hangover 2.
They used to take cruises together. It's all in the archives now.
You may actually need to remove North Korea from your list of communist economies, because in many respects it is a hybrid. There's trade with China, largest trading partner, about $4 billion a year now, but a significant amount of the North Korean economy is criminal, and it's managed. It was managed personally by Kim Jong-il when he was the operations director in the party, but it involves counterfeiting $100 super notes, euros, counterfeit Viagra, which is an odd business. I don't know how you get away with that, but anyway, tobacco, aspirin, the huge criminal enterprise. And the North Koreans, there are interesting sort of international North Koreans who speak languages and have some foreign training, who show up suddenly as their ambassadors in Stockholm or in Switzerland or in Macau or London. And it turns out the reason they're there is to manage the illicit money flows. So the other obstacle is, in addition to the fact that there was no purging of the Gang of Four and no Deng like China, it's still the same dynasty, it's a highly criminal economy at the top. And they like that because it's untraceable cash, which is a great way to maintain control. So I'm with Victor on the pessimist side about opening. This is, I think, a very different case from Burma, even, and certainly different from China.
Thank you, professors, for talking to us. My question is mostly directed to Professor Lee, but any of you would be very qualified to talk about this. Mostly on the Chinese perspective. I actually was, I don't want to say lucky, but enough to witness and live through both the sinking of the Cheonan and the bombing of Yeonpyeong Island while living in South Korea. And what I noticed there was a great calmness and kind of sang-froid among the Korean people as this was going on, compared to the absolute freaking out that was happening on the international press. And so it became very clear that the perspectives and the stories were very different. So from there, and then all the talk was, why don't we pressure China? Why don't we pressure China? And it seemed to me that they absolutely were in this position where North Korea was a very essential buffer zone for them. So then what seemed to us, who are they buffering themselves from? It would seem to be the US. So I would ask, in what degree, in what sense do you think that our presence there is perhaps stopping China from taking a more aggressive stance against North Korea in order to kind of have that buffer zone? How are we getting in our own way, is my question, or are we getting in our own way?
Thank you.
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think my point, I mean, I really appreciate your question. I think it's a very important one. If you think about the presence of US forces in South Korea and Japan, I mean, I must say that when China think about the peninsula question, I don't think it's limited just to the peninsula. It actually has longer term perspective, that's my observation, and broader perspective. So, you know, these questions, Korea question and Taiwan, they are all linked. I have a feeling that when Chinese are dealing with North Koreans, they're actually dealing with the American counterparts. So in that sense, you know, you probably have learned that Chinese have ambivalent attitude towards, say, US forces in Japan because they believe it keeps the Japanese aspiration by some to remilitarize and so on. So I don't think Chinese are very clear as to, you know, what they actually want from US forces in South Korea and Japan. But but also remember the Korean War. The UN forces led by US and Chinese forces actually were in hot war, military conflict. So, you know, in the event that US forces were to come all the way to Pyongyang, I don't think it will be a very pleasant picture from the perspective of the Chinese. So I'm talking in somewhat hypothetical and abstract situation, not necessarily meaning that Chinese are just like, can't stand US forces in South Korea.
Can I just add, I don't think that it's very likely that there would be, in the event of a collapse of North Korea, US forces on the Yalu River. For one reason, we don't have that many forces left. We won't after the current round of budget cuts. But the other reason is that the South Korean military is more than capable of managing this. And the US role would be limited to special military operations like controlling weapons of mass destruction, some humanitarian relief. And then we'd have a very important role in terms of mustering international support diplomatically and financially. And I think that the Chinese officials know that. I think what worries the Chinese the most is probably first what Professor Lee said, which is the historic geostrategic implications of a unified Korea for China's own ethnic mix in Manchuria and Northeast China, and the ideological implications of a regime collapsing and aligning with a democracy that's pro-West. I mean, those are big sort of existential geostrategic level problems that I think are much more complicating for the Chinese than US forces, because we'd have a Marine Expeditionary Unit or a battalion. It would just not be that intimidating. And then the other thing they worry about is just chaos and instability and refugee flows, which right now for China, they've got enough problems at home. They don't want problems on their border. I think that would be sort of their main concern.
Hi, Jimmy Tobine, second year MSFS. Thanks so much for talking to us today. My question is, I'm wondering about if there is another test, what are the political implications for the US, for China, for Japan, for Korea in this election year, and what sort of response can we expect to see? Thank you.
Maybe we should start by what kind of test we think it would be.
Uranium or plutonium?
Yeah. So if you had to make a bet, I mean, if they did a third nuclear test, it would, you know, just if you had to make a bet, it would probably be to try to test a uranium-based weapon. Right? And if that were in conjunction with another long-range ballistic missile test, and there was evidence that they were able to do these two successfully, as well as miniaturize a warhead and put it on a missile, that would, I mean, people suspect these things, but when they happen, that's when you really sort of see strategic ripples. And I think you would probably see some major strategic ripples in the region. Because we've all been sort of, I mean, quite frankly, living with the fiction that somehow we're going to be able to denuclearize North Korea. But if events take us in the other direction, that fiction kind of gets shattered, and people have to start living with the real strategic reality. I think at the expert community level, you know, people are living with this and trying to deal with it, but it would become, I think, a more popular question and issue. And that would then put a lot of pressure on politicians to respond. And so I think it would have a major impact.
I would just add, I mean, there would be the political pressures for political reasons, but there would also be the legitimate strategic concern in the sense that given our uncertainties and knowledge gaps with regard to the North Korean weapons program, a test itself is more significant in terms of what it proves or demonstrates, as opposed to, say, Pakistan when they've had their first test in 1998. It really wasn't a surprise, even though, you know, there was a political reason to describe it as a surprise in some quarters. It wasn't a surprise in terms of, you know, the state of our knowledge or what their capabilities were. Whereas with the North Koreans, the test per se would be an important data point.
And the things to watch, I think, would be if it's plutonium, what do we know about, and I think we'll be able to tell some things, weaponization. You know, they've been able to explode a device in a way that suggests they're getting closer, or maybe even crossing the threshold of being able to weaponize it. And then if it's uranium, just the fact that they could blow it up is problematic because a lot of the things you can do to follow plutonium production are much harder in the case of uranium because it's underground, it's harder, it's easier to hide, it's easier to crank them out once you're spinning centrifuges. There are a lot of uranium mines in North Korea, so it's a big, big deal. People sometimes say, well, why would North Korea do that in an election year? They'll just get the next administration mad here, the next administration mad in South Korea. Maybe. On the other hand, I think Pyongyang's probably right in betting that Park Geun-hye or Ahn Cheol-soo or whoever comes next, right or left in Korea, is going to be more pro-engagement. I think they want to get these tests and keep moving forward. So if you're going to do it, it's better to do it now, drop it on the world, take some sanctions, then start cutting deals. Because unfortunately, we've taught them over the last 15 years that we get over it, that we come back. So, but Professor Cha's question, what kind of test? That's really, really critical.
You can be certain that it's going to be on a holiday.
Yeah.
One of our holidays.
Christmas, 4th of July.
Christmas, 4th of July. Or, yeah. The maddest I ever saw the Chinese at six-party talks was when North Korea proposed another round of six-party talks on the Chinese New Year. I mean, if it was during our Christmas week, they were like, come on, isn't this more important than Christmas? It's about denuclearization of, you know, East Asia and security of your allies. But if it was Chinese New Year, they're like, how dare they? Where were we with the mics? Okay.
Hi, I'm Claire Lee. I'm a senior in the SFS. And from my understanding, it took a full day until after Kim Jong-Il's death for it to be formally announced to, I guess, the international community. And I was just wondering if you find it either worrisome or shocking that neither the US or South Korean intelligence communities were able to detect his death until it was formally announced.
Paul, do you want to?
It's not worrisome or shocking to me.
And also,
Why should it be? You know?
And just because the press has not reported that the intelligence community knew it does not mean they did not know it. Not everything leaks. I mean, I don't have any inside information, but we shouldn't assume just because there's no public reporting that our intel officials knew it that somehow it was known. And it does suggest that it was a sudden heart attack or something, and they were not, as Professor Cha suggests, not quite ready. Thought they had some years.
Thank you. My name is Carson Stam, and I'm from Germany. So when we heard the news of Kim Jong-il's death, we in Germany started to daydream. What if maybe this is a chance? We had reunification, maybe they can have a chance. But then if we think back at how it was for us, it wasn't really in our hands. It was in the hands of France, the United States, and Great Britain, the Soviet Union. And they supported it in the end, so that's why we had reunification. So the question is, if you look at the countries that might have a say in the reunification of North Korea and South Korea, what are their options? Aren't they maybe content with the status quo? Or if they could say, this would be a best case scenario from our view, what would China, what would South Korea, what would Japan, what would the United States state as their best case scenario? Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
Great, sure. Talking about unification in South Korean politics contexts, during the years when South Korean government was pursuing sunshine policy was somewhat of a taboo because they were afraid that North Koreans will take it as a South Korean observing the North Korean regime. But it was perhaps when President Lee Myung-bak came to office that he little by little started talking about unification, and there is a new political party which was established like a few days ago, who, the people who are very interested in pushing for, towards unification. So, in South Korea, there are about two views towards unification. One is taking very nationalistic kind of approach where, the same, race, there has to be this, national identity kind of coming together. The other view is that unification is not just a matter of between North and South Korea. You actually have to work very closely together with surrounding great powers. And this is where China, US, Japan, Russia actually comes in. So, I think, I don't know, perhaps Professors Cha and Green and could talk more about US perspectives on unification, but it has been understood that the Chinese actually are not very much in favor of seeing two Koreas being unified because it is likely that it will be under South Korean system. Then there's the whole question that Professor Green has just talked about, the ideology and the nature of regime, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, does that answer your question?
I think we have time for maybe two more. And so if we could, want to bring one down here, Don Kirk. He's traveled all the way from, I don't know where. Right?
Well, I just have a quick question on the news. The name of Kim Jong-nam has come up lately, and we all know the amusing remarks he's made to the Japanese author and Japanese media. But what does this really say about what's going on beneath the surface there, and what does this indicate about discontent that we don't really know about at the level of generals and colonels and lower-ranking generals and colonels and mid-level officials and all kinds of other people? Do we have any insights, any perceptions? Does Kim Jong-nam have pipelines into these people? Okay, that's just my maybe impossible question.
So Kim Jong-nam is the eldest of the late Kim Jong-il's three sons. He's the one probably most famously known to the average interested observer because he tried to go to Disneyland in Japan on a Dominican Republican passport. and was detained by immigration authorities and was interrogated for an hour, for which he said nothing. And then after an hour, he finally said, "I'm the son of the North Korean leader. I was trying to go to Disney World. I'm hungry. Can you get me a hamburger?" Right? So, and so he is now, I guess he's in Macau or outside of North Korea, and occasionally talks to press and has been saying some things that indicate, well, he's been saying things about how he didn't think this structure would hold up. So people don't know what to make of that. You know, Don, I don't think any of us know really what to make of it. I think, I mean, if you think of it, so if we think of this as a dynastic succession, you think of sort of who are the, if there are sort of intra-family sort of fissures, where would they come? I mean, certainly among the sons, among the three sons is one possibility. And then the other is, you know, the Kim Jong-il's younger sister, right? Kim Kyung-hee, the aunt of the current leader of North Korea, who is really the only one of Kim Jong-il's generation that really is still left in terms of the family. And she's sick too, right? So if she dies, then all you're left with is the uncle, right? And the young son, right? And the uncle is not part of the family. He's part of the family by marriage. And if you know Korean history, this has happened before, right? In Korean history, where the uncle tries to kill the son. Right? So you have the whole makings of a novel here, or a movie. But the short answer is I really don't think we know. No.
The, when Kim Il-sung died, South Korean Unification Ministry, foreign governments, academics who had interactions with North Koreans detected a definite change in tone. It was not huge, but there was, for the first time, some implicit or even explicit criticism or questions about Kim Jong-il, which is why in the mid to 90s, the US, Korea, Japan started planning for the first time about what we would do if the regime collapsed, because we'd never heard that kind of criticism. It was only at the margins, it was limited, but it was unheard of. I would suspect you'll hear even more with the next dynastic succession. But Kim Jong-nam is a particular, unique case. The North Koreans have assassinated or attempted to assassinate inner circle critics of the regime who've left. Hwang Jong-yap, there were several assassination attempts against him. He was the senior-most propaganda official who defected to the south. Would they go so far as to assassinate someone from the inner family? Because if Kim Jong-nam were not the son of Kim Jong-il, he'd have a serious security problem, put it that way. It would not be a good idea to take long walks on the beach at sunset with his Brazilian girlfriends and his Mickey Mouse T-shirt. He would be a target. So it will be very interesting to see where that goes. He apparently has done interviews and things that are going to come out in more detail that will give even more gory details that will drive the regime nuts, because the regime's gone out of its way to push the propaganda line that Kim Jong-un is in charge and is beloved by the army and the people.
Maybe one last quick question.
Thanks. There was a recent report earlier this month that the North Korea is ranked last on the nuclear safety among some 30 countries that own nuclear materials. Does this pose any sort of urgency on the part of US, China, or any other regional powers on a need to better manage the North Korean problem? And more particularly, does this possibly run counter to the common assumption that having nukes make a state more stable?
Well, I think the short answer to the question is yes. There should be more conversations, particularly between the United States and China, about nuclear safety. I mean, particularly in the aftermath of March 2011 and what happened in Fukushima. You know, Japan was probably at the far end of the nuclear safety spectrum, and it's pretty certain North Korea is at the other end of the nuclear safety spectrum. And this should be something that concerns China, because if anything were to happen to its reactor or reactors, you know, we don't know, that would have all sorts of ramifications for China. But what makes sense rationally, of course, is not what happens necessarily in international relations, because for the United States, the political obstacle is if you start talking about nuclear safety with North Korea, then everybody says you've basically accepted them as a nuclear weapon state, and that would cause problems with our allies. And for the Chinese, you know, they have all sorts of neuralgia when it comes to US discussions with the United States about anything with regard to North Korea, except for six-party talks. So perhaps you could raise it in the context of six-party talks.
It's actually quite worrisome just to ruin this and have it end on a really depressing, scary note. You know, in 2004, when Gaddafi gave up all of his programs and let the US government and the British government come in and pick over them, you may have been quite involved in this, it's now a matter of public record. The US found traces of uranium flexofluoride 6, UF6, which was on some of the equipment that the Libyans had gotten from North Korea. Did they transfer uranium? Probably not, but were they possibly commingling uranium and other things? Very probably, very worrisome. In 2007, September, the Israeli Air Force bombed El Kibar, a reactor-like, a reactor complex, which the US intelligence community said was built with the help of North Koreans, and North Koreans were there. The AQ-Con network of proliferation, the North Koreans were very plugged into that. Plus they have, it's estimated, the largest biological and chemical weapons arsenal in the world. So they've got a lot of stuff. They have a bad record of controlling it. If anything, they have a record of sort of flirting with selling it or transferring it. They've been talking to the junta in Burma. We don't know how much, but there's some evidence of dialogue there. And then the collapse scenario is particularly scary because how do you control all of that? So it's a real nightmare. And the idea that somehow that North Korea could be trusted with light water reactors or some peaceful nuclear capability is pretty much, I think, gone in US, Korean, Japanese government thinking. At one point, you know, we thought about providing them so-called proliferation-proof light water reactors. I don't think anybody in this administration is contemplating that, or in Japan or Korea or Europe, which were all part of the consortium to try to give them this LWR capability.
Well, on that happy note,
yeah.
I want to thank my colleagues for joining us today, and thank you.